Thanks everybody for joining us here on a special live edition of what I'm calling the Texas Take Live. This is, Scott Braddock with the Quorum Report and I. We do a regular podcast weekly, the number one political podcast in the great state of Texas, of course. If you know me from there, great. You certainly know Scott from there, that's for sure. But we also, today what we're going to do is we're going to, kind of get into some of the stuff that we talked about on that show, but kind of broaden this out to kind of get you ready for this election cycle that we're about to get into. Look, Texas is not a battleground state. Nobody's going to pretend that it is right now. It's like we are not Wisconsin. We are not Pennsylvania. But what we are is far more competitive than a lot of people understand. I think one of the things I've been trying to pitch to people is that, look, Texas was decided by 5.6 percentage points. That's not only the closest race that Texas has had in 3 decades, but it's also one of the closest races in the entire nation. In fact, we're the 9th closest presidential race from 2020, the race between Biden and Donald Trump. That was the 9th. Texas was 9th closest in the entire nation. There's a lot of reasons that's happening. Look, it's like, and if you look at the list up there, like we're right after Michigan and Florida. A traditional battleground where, candidates spend billions of dollars trying to swing people. Michigan, where like the candidates are constantly there. And it's like, again, Texas, we're not there yet, but we're on that next peripheral. When you see candidates, both Trump campaign and the Kamala Harris campaign have both been doing advertising in North Carolina. Right. Look where we fit on that list. We're like right there behind it. And so you can see how a lot has happened to kind of make Texas a lot more competitive. And what we want to get into is how that affects down ballot races everywhere and what is actually causing this to happen. And so, like, I have Joyce doing with me, the Houston Chronicle's, columnist, who really kind of understands Harris County probably better than anybody that I know of, at least. She will help us kind of navigate what we're seeing in Harris County, what's been making, this community change so much over the years and really kind of change the dynamics of the presidential race. And we'll talk a lot about the I-35 corridor. I like to call it the blue spine. I always tell people Texas remains a red state, but we have a blue spine running through the middle of it, which can make some of our politics sometimes look more purple than most people understand. So that's how we're going to kind of start with this thing. And so I want to first kind of get into that presidential race. Kamala Harris has replaced Joe Biden, obviously, at the top of this ticket.
Oh, you noticed that?
Yeah. Well, what
a month in politics in America and Texas.
Yeah, I like to, say, wow, this last month has been one hell of a decade, hasn't it? Because that's what it feels like, right? And then I think, the first thing out of the box was, boy, how does Kamala Harris change this race? And so one of the first things I wanted to ask Joy is about, like, a piece that she wrote, right after Kamala Harris was named to the ticket. It was within a couple of days, they had, an event that they were going to have 1,000, women online to, help support Kamala Harris, but the attendance was off the chart. Joy, tell us a little bit about what you saw in what happening there and what you may be picking up from why it was happening. What is going on there?
Well, it's interesting that I have been part of that group, just listening virtually. It's called Win with Black Women, and they have been in existence through the pandemic, meeting every Sunday virtually, just to talk about different issues legislatively. Sometimes they have celebrities on there. So this particular call was just one of the regular calls that they would have every Sunday, and I got the notice that it was going to be about 1,000. And then, once you heard the announcement about Joe Biden stepping out, that it became, okay, it's going to be 5,000. And we got on the call and they kept shutting it down, and it went up to 10,000, then 20,000, then 30,000. I think it reached 40,000, and it maybe reached past that. And what was interesting is the level of excitement, and I think real strong interest in what was happening. I think there was a sense of okay, there's hope for these women who were on this call, that maybe they can that their voice would be heard in the voting ballot. So That's what I saw on that when I was on that call. And then the subsequent days, you had the Black men for Kamala Harris, who had about 40,000. And then the one that really shocked me was the white women for Kamala Harris. And they had over 180,000 women on that call or something like that, and raised over $8.5 million for Harris. And what was interesting about that particular call is that you had the gamut of age. You had, singer Pink. She was on there talking to the women, as well as some, celebrities and authors. And they were just talking about how more white women needed to voice their opinion, have a voice in this election. And I don't think we've seen that in that mass, with all of those different groups coming together behind one candidate, which was actually kind of
it's interesting too. It's like right after that, that's when we saw Kamala Harris come to Houston. Like she spoke to another Black sorority group, particularly and that room was, I have not seen that many people at the George R. Brown Convention Center in a long time. It was it was like a sea of people, and the energy, it just it took this race, it feels like, that was going to be, a Biden-Trump campaign felt like a slow redo, right?
You know what it really felt like? Have either of you ever been stuck in an elevator?
Yeah,
I have. I was stuck in an elevator in Houston downtown once, and I think I was stuck in there for about 3 hours. They had to get the fire department to come out and open the doors and all that. And the race for Democrats for about the last 2 years has felt like being stuck in an elevator. Like they were just stuck. They had nowhere to go. They were depressed. And when you look at what happened, when those doors opened, when there was some movement, once I got out of that elevator, I wanted to sprint. I wanted to run. And that's what they're doing. And you see Kamala Harris in this historic way, consolidating support, within the Democratic Party like that. The party acted like a party when it hadn't been doing that for about 2 years, just really depressed, wondering because if you looked at all the polling, leading up to the Republican presidential primary, most of them liked Trump, but it was still a primary, right? But the Democrats didn't have anything like that. But if you asked Democrats at that time, who would they like to see running instead? They didn't have an answer. As soon as there was an answer, they were ready to go.
Right.
Well, and I think both these points, get to a larger issue going on in Texas, right? Like the energy that I think we're seeing in Harris County, with Kamala Harris coming to visit there, I think is representative beyond just Texas. Obviously, it's like we can't be in other states, but you can see the energy, at least in the polling, shows the race is getting closer. And I kind of want to talk about specifically like what's happened. So there's two reasons, like I said, that Texas has become more competitive. One is Harris County, the biggest county in the state, and the third most populous in the entire nation. It's a county that voted regularly Republican for 30 years. It's like there was no hope for Democrats. George W. Bush carried Harris County by 100,000 votes each time. It was just not a competition. Ted Cruz and Greg Abbott both carried. They're both Republicans with some Houston connections and ties. They both carried Harris County. But what's happened over these last, I'm going to say 6 years is the window I'm kind of looking at. It's been a complete sea change. Now the results are coming in regularly. As I posted earlier out there, you saw that what happened in Texas politics didn't just happen nationally, where Joe Biden got within 5.6 percentage points of winning against Donald Trump. What happened in Harris County was he ended up winning Harris County by over 200,000 votes. Now, remember, Bush won it by 100,000, and we have now Joe Biden winning it by plus 200,000. That's a 300,000 vote swing in just one corner of the state in a race that was decided by 600,000. So it doesn't take you long to understand that if there's a way for Kamala Harris to unlock energy from not just the old guard labor union folks, but if he can, if Kamala Harris can get in there and tap into a more diverse electorate, get young people fired up, get Black, Hispanic communities engaged in this election, you can see how it quickly changes the math in Texas, and that you can see translates all over the place. And so like, and one of the areas I was really kind of looking at is like in Harris County, particularly in the 18th Congressional District, that's that area where Sheila Jackson Lee was a representative for nearly 30 years. She just passed away, obviously. And now the question is, what happens in that district? And why I think it's interesting for the presidential race is now there's going to be an election on November 5th, a special election to fill that seat, even though Sylvester Turner has already been selected to be the candidate for the Democrats for the 2-year term. Now it's a little confusing, but so there's still going to be an election on that day that's going to turn out voters. There's another reason why voters will want to come out in that district to vote, for like, hey, do I want, who do I want? Do I want Sylvester Turner, the former mayor? Do I want Amanda Edwards? Do I want a host of other candidates who could be on that ballot? So I think it's going to bring a little bit more energy to it. So that brings us all back to that point. Like in Harris County, it's like there's a reason why Kamala Harris spent 4 days out of her first 10 days in Harris County, right?
Right. I mean, you could mistake us for a battleground state that first week of her campaign, right? Because she was here. You were there at the events, and you love history.
Yeah.
Jeremy. I mean, think about the fact that Houston and Harris County is the cradle nationally of the establishment of the Republican Party. George H.W. Bush was the party chair, right? Especially West Houston, the other side of town from where you're talking about in the Sheila Jackson Lee district. It's Trump. It's Trump. At quorumreport.com, we like to say that people are either civilians or combatants when it comes to politics. No one has turned more people into combatants than Donald Trump. And look how many Republicans are in Houston and Harris County. But a lot of them are those old school Republican establishment types. Yeah. They are completely turned off by Trump. So now you have the race you're talking about to fill that seat for Sheila Jackson Lee. And even absent that, I would say that, in African-American communities in Houston and Harris County, places like Sunnyside, Acres Homes, et cetera, that turnout's going to be astronomical anyway, right? Because they have an she didn't just turn black like Trump said. They have an African-American woman at the top of the ticket. They've never seen anything like that. And I'm reminded of when, and no predictions here, but I'm reminded of when Obama did get elected. I was at an event where I literally watched an African-American elderly woman pass out because she couldn't believe that had happened. And that's the level of excitement we're seeing right now with the Democrats.
Yeah, and Joy, I think you'll remember, when Barack Obama on his second run for the presidency, he won Harris County, but it was a handful of votes. It was like I think it was 197 votes that he won, or 1,000 votes that he won the entire county by. Yeah. But so it was a very minimal number, despite all the energy. Right. But now with so many more registered voters, one of the things I keep pointing out to people, the number of registered voters in Harris County is growing faster than the population. Like, wait, how is that possible, right? But what's happened, it's not just people, everybody likes to say, oh, all these Californians are moving here to Texas, but it goes way beyond that. This is a lot of backfilling that particularly the Democratic Party after 2014 got really serious about. They started registering people in a much more aggressive way, trying to figure out how to combat the election laws in Texas, which make it a felony. If you violate Texas election law and sign up somebody to register to vote in the wrong county and you're not a deputy registrar allowed to do that, you could be facing felony charges, which is why the League of Women Voters stopped doing it. But what we've seen is a lot of backfill in places like Harris County and Bexar County, where people who have lived for decades in San Antonio or in Houston, now are starting to register to vote in numbers, again, greater than the population gain, which shows you what is changing some of the dynamics, particularly in Harris County. And I would love to kind of get your take, Joy, on like that energy level. It's like obviously coming off of, what we were just talking about with Kamala Harris. Do you get a sense that people are now getting a little bit more engaged?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also, I think that there was a level of apathy, and I think it was growing, it was pretty significant as, Republican stronghold, you hear all of the Trump rhetoric and such. And there was a feeling, at least even when I talked with younger voters, I taught on a college campus and I would talk to them about why they weren't voting. And they said they didn't really believe that their vote would matter. And I heard that time and time again, and there was this level of apathy. And I think what has happened now is it's given some hope that their vote can matter, that their vote will make a difference in some way. I also want to say that Kamala Harris appeals in many ways because, one, she's a woman, and this is unprecedented, right? And two, she appeals to immigrants, Black Americans who are graduates of historically Black universities, who are part of the Divine Nine, which are the sororities and fraternities, which are very significant in this culture and in the power dynamics of politics and our economy. So I think there are so many issues here that really have galvanized a lot of people and made them excited. And frankly, it's kind of exciting now, right? It just feels really, it's like, wow, everything just changed. And so
Yeah.
it feels very exciting about what's happening.
And from a very Republican standpoint, so one of the things I think just kind of sets up this landscape very differently that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but I'll certainly be writing a lot more about it in the Texas Tech newsletter and we'll be talking about it in the podcast, which is like, so, when President Trump was in office, when he was beginning his reelection, they made an investment in Texas. I'm not kidding. They were literally, setting up field offices and working neighborhoods in Texas, like a year out from the election. I was with them in San Antonio at one point where they were organizing neighborhood groups a year out, trying to get prepared for what was to come. That's not happening this time.
Right.
There is nobody on the ground for the Trump people in their official campaign capacity. Look, there's still a Republican Party that can do that, some of that stuff, but it doesn't have the same apparatus that's working in the neighborhoods. So what you see is like, not only does Kamala Harris now have this different energy that she's kind of brought to the Democratic ticket, you have a Trump campaign that doesn't have the same apparatus on the ground in San Antonio, in Harris County, in Tarrant County, trying to kind of make sure they can develop those votes.
Right. Well, and they're going to assume that they don't need it, right? Because this is a Republican state, and before the Democrats who are watching get too excited about the blue areas like Harris County and the blue spine that you talk about often on our show, there still is that red wall out there in rural Texas, right? And Republicans in this state can historically bank about 1 million votes in the rural parts of the state, which offsets this dynamic growth in places like Houston and Harris County, Dallas-Fort Worth, San Antonio, and the corridor between SA and Austin. And there's also been a lot of investment by Republicans in a different region of the state, which we haven't mentioned, which is the Valley. And we've talked a lot on our show about, the fact that one thing that you would do if you were going to try to find more rural conservative voters, no matter what color they were, is go to the Valley. And I remember in the 2014 election, when Governor Abbott, at that time Attorney General Abbott, was taking on Senator Wendy Davis, he was spending a lot of money in the Valley, even in an election where he was expected to just destroy her, which he did. I mean, people, I'm not going to rain on everybody's parade, but roughly $40 million was spent on Wendy Davis's behalf, and she still lost to Greg Abbott by 20 points, right? And that's what they expected. And so some Republicans were asking, why is Abbott spending so much money in the Valley? They were planting the seeds for later, right? They were starting to create infrastructure for later. But I do think, to your point about Texas being more competitive, think about how we're not nearly as Republican as California is Democratic, right? I mean,
Correct.
To your point about the 5-point spread between Biden and Trump, you know what it was for Biden and Trump in California? It was more than 20 points for Biden there.
Yeah, we're definitely not Alabama for the Republicans.
That's right. So look, Trump has, he has no choice. He's fighting for his life now because of what Joy said about the way this is all re-energized on the Democratic side. They're out of that stuck elevator now. And now they're battling it out in those actual battleground states.
Yeah. Well, let me stop here for a minute. It's like, if you have questions that you would like to toss our way, drop them into the Q&A in the Zoom. And we'll take a look at those and we'll read some of those on air and try to address as many of those as we can. But I want to kind of dovetail on what you said, because this is a perfect transition into, is Texas close? Well, who you can ask, is Texas closer than it looks? Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz knows this better than anybody. And it's a lot to do with that blue spine that I've talked about. Again, the blue spine for me is I-35 going from Laredo all the way up into DFW, taking in those suburbs of Collin and Denton County. There's been a lot of population change there, right? It's become diverse, it's become younger, and it's changed the politics. And I like to try to back things up as much with numbers, right? Like people already know, like there's growth there, right? I get it, but let's look at what the numbers have looked like. Again, Republicans carried the I-35 corridor religiously for 30 years. Like nobody in the Democratic Party came close to winning that area since Ann Richards in 1990.
Right.
That was
just
the last
Austin,
time.
and that was it. Rick Perry used to say Austin was the blueberry and the tomato soup,
and there was no
right.
spine.
And
it
everything else is
yeah.
yeah.
It's like, and so, but what has happened, particularly over these last 6 years, like we started to see a shift. Again, John Cornyn wins this, blue spine that I'm talking about in his previous reelect in 2016 with over 300,000 votes. Okay, 300,000 votes. Just remember that. Hillary Clinton, when she runs for president in 2016, she wins that same spine by 100,000 votes. But guess what? Beto O'Rourke in 2018 against Ted Cruz wins 400,000 vote margin off of that same blue. Again, this is an area that was going plus 300,000. It's now a 700,000 vote swing for a potential Democratic candidate. And it wasn't just a Beto phenomenon. A lot of people say, oh, that was just Beto and that happened again. Guess what? Biden, when he ran, almost duplicated exactly what Biden, that Beto had gotten out of that line. And so what you see is that has now shifted the politics to where if you listen to Ted Cruz, he'll tell you, look, everything's close. Everything's tight. Like I have to keep campaigning. And he is right. It's like, because the math has changed. He's going to lose Harris County. It's like, he knows that. I know that. You know that. We all know that, right? It's like, but he used to win Harris County.
Right.
And so he knows, like, you have to make those votes up somewhere. And it goes to what you were saying, like in that last campaign in 2018, the reason that Ted Cruz got reelected is because, I like to say he did the George Strait theory, which is Amarillo by morning, but then add by afternoon, night, next day, swing some East Texas in there. He got vote margins out of those areas. He had 70 to 80% turnout in some of those smaller counties. And if you knit them all together, they can produce enough to give you a 219,000 vote victory, is what we discovered.
Yeah.
But those math numbers are changing. Those populations are starting to sink some or remain flat in some of those counties, while this blue spine and Harris County continue to grow.
I mean, to Joy's point about how exciting it all is, every part of the state matters. There are a lot of Republicans in these quote unquote blue places, right? There's a lot of Republicans in Houston and Harris County and San Antonio and Dallas. They're just outvoted by Democrats in those areas. Republicans really dominate the rural areas. And to your point about the 2018 election, look, it's my understanding that Cruz was told at least 6 months out from election day that this is a 3-point race, and he didn't believe it. He wasn't taking it seriously. He was starting to see the energy with the Beto O'Rourke, campaign, what was happening with that candidacy. And I do agree with Senator Cornyn, who had said there was basically 3 things happening in that race. You had backlash to Trump in the midterm. You have backlash to Cruz himself, which, there are a lot of Republicans who are not thrilled with Cruz. He has the most punchable face in the United States Senate, according to one of his colleagues who was a Republican. And 3, you had this guy, Beto O'Rourke, kind of set the world on fire. People hadn't heard of this guy before. So Cruz has to compete everywhere. He didn't go to Amarillo by morning or go to Texarkana or these other places until late in the campaign, right? When he started to internalize that he was maybe losing. And remember, on election night, when the first returns came in, and of course you'll watch for this, folks, on election night, you got to wait the whole time because the early returns will come in first from the big urban centers, and it'll look like Democrats are winning in Texas. That's what happened election night. Remember, it looked like Dan Patrick might lose. It looked like, that Cruz was maybe going to lose. And I had Republican consultants texting me and say, no. Wait for all those rural boxes to come in, and you saw that rising tide of the Republicans, coming, striking back, and so you're still going to have that kind of dynamic going on. But to your point, I think it could be closer than ever. We'll see what happens.
Well, and that brings us to Colin Allred, right? Yeah. Colin Allred is absolutely not Beto O'Rourke. I think we can all agree to that, right?
You mean Colin is not going to ride his skateboard through a Whataburger parking lot and give with the middle finger and all that? He's not dropping the F-bomb all the time?
Absolutely
he's
not.
He's a little more disciplined than that.
Yeah, he's a much more, I was just with him in Harris County this week, as he's had a different approach to his campaign, right? He's not doing the rallies everywhere. He's not every corner of the state kind of campaigning. He's kind of knitting a combination of, I think, the Wendy Davis strategy, which was make sure you have enough money to advertise and get your message out before in this case, Ted Cruz can get it out for you. And secondly, do some of those events, but not spend as much time in those rallies, which kind of like brings me to the question of like, what, like, I think Colin Allred has a lot of appeal, particularly for people in Dallas-Fort Worth who are familiar with him and know his story. He might actually do okay in a place like Waco, a Baylor University graduate who can kind of make a case. But I think in Bexar County and in Harris County, he's about as unknown as you can get. Tell me, Joy, like, do you get a sense that people know who Colin Allred is at this point? Are you starting to see advertisements in Harris County? Is there any buzz that you're seeing that, because I'm not picking that up yet?
I don't think I am either, but I am seeing, the TV ads. I did see him at Sheila Jackson Lee's funeral. I know some people who work in his office in Houston. So, I see a little bit, but I don't see it to the extent of that I would expect at this point. And I don't know what that is. And I don't know if that's indication of, where he is in this, election in his cycle. So, I don't know. I have not seen a whole lot of much of him.
And I think a lot of people kind of have that same kind of feel too. Like I had somebody say, "Oh, we haven't seen him west of I-35, this whole year." So
yeah, well, I mean, look, the tell for me is that even political professionals don't ask me about that race. They don't have anything to say about it just yet. At this point, I think for the broader public and for the political nerds who are watching a Zoom like this. Even among those folks, I just don't hear much about the race, right? And I do think that for a general audience, the truth is the presidential race goes on forever. That's always on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and everywhere. But for a Senate race like this, we need to be fair to both candidates because it really doesn't start until after the political conventions are over. Once we get to Labor Day, you'll start to see the tens of millions of dollars in advertising, especially hitting the airwaves in places like Houston and Harris County, in San Antonio, in DFW. Both these guys have a lot of cash, right? I mean, cumulatively, they have about $30 million to spend, and there'll be more. I'm interested to know what Allred has spent all that money on so far. I think he's burned at least $25 or $30 million so far. You would think that it would be crunching a lot of data, going through the numbers and figuring out which voters they really need to interact with and try to get fired up. But some things never change. I remember when Bill White, this was back in 2010, when Bill White was running as a former Houston mayor, running for governor against Rick Perry. And at that time, the headline said something like this: Bill White distancing himself from President Obama at that time. And look what Allred is doing. Those headlines are the same, distancing himself from Kamala Harris. And the truth is, they run together. And in the minds of the vast majority of people, even though we don't have straight ticket voting anymore, the vast majority of people in Texas are going to vote straight ticket. The difference, though, I think, or one difference in that blue spine that you're talking about and in those big cities is not just that we've, brought a lot of people in from California. By the way, note to Governor Abbott and the little governor, Dan Patrick, you can't brag forever about having people move from California and expect that it'll never change your politics. That is happening. But at the same time, Republicans are also running off some people who have a history of voting for them. Suburban women very angry about what's gone on with the abortion restrictions in this state. The same group that's very unhappy with any, a lack of any kind of gun safety legislation after the shootings in Uvalde, Santa Fe, Sutherland Springs, and I can go on. They're very angry about that, and they're at least open. That's not a guarantee, but they're open to voting for Democrats now.
Well, and you just hit on a really important point for that Senate race, particularly those suburban women. They it's like the registration numbers in those suburban counties is ridiculously high. We're like, I was telling you earlier that, look, Harris County has been growing, but the voter registration is growing faster than the population. But you look at a place like, Hayes, Williamson County, those two counties are very suburban counties around the Travis County area. Their voter registration is growing 30%. It's like 40% in some cases. It's like you can see that area is changing so much that it's just changed the math for candidates to kind of figure out. And I think there's and and we've talked about it. It's like, look, Allred's campaign, as much as they want to distance themselves from the Kamala Harris campaign, I was with them yesterday. If you read the Houston Chronicle, San Antonio Express News today, there's a story in there about how Colin Allred is trying to distance himself from some of the energy policies of the Biden administration to say, look, I'm not going to get rid of oil and gas.
And the border.
Yeah, we've seen it on the border as well. But that speaks to, look, he doesn't want to be associated with them, but he also needs that energy at the top of the ticket that Joy was talking about before. Like, he needs that energy that Kamala Harris brings to kind of help him get that vote out in Harris County. And that applies all the way down the ticket. The thing is, when you have an exciting race at the top of the ticket, it changes the math even further down. It's like, I think I speak for a lot of people in Texas who were shocked during the 2018 U.S. Senate race. Again, Beto O'Rourke is running against Ted Cruz, makes it a tight race. But beyond that, look what else happened in the state of Texas. We had 12 Texas House, seats flip over from Republican to Democrat that a lot of people didn't see coming. And 10 of those seats were along this blue spine I'm telling you about. It's like, in that politics changed not only the Texas legislature going forward, and Joy and I, we talked about this before about the judicial races. But you go all the way down the ballot. Every judicial race was held by a Republican in 2014. And after that 2018 election cycle, every judicial seat was held by a Democrat in Harris County.
Well, and remember that the fact that we had one punch straight ticket voting in Texas prior to that, Republicans were, up until that point, always against getting rid of the straight ticket voting. And then after that election, suddenly they were for getting rid of it, right? And of course, having the one punch straight ticket voting is a holdover from the old Confederacy, and the way that it was the Democrats who used it to stay in power at that time. So there's some irony there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so we're going forward here, like, let's go back into the Texas legislature, because I think that's one of the areas that I think, as we kind of move forward, and I know we have a lot of, people on the line, from Beaumont, from the Beaumont Enterprise region. And, they're probably really particularly interested in, like, hey, what's going to happen with this Texas legislature? If there's a more competitive race at the top of this ticket, does this affect Texas, legislature seats? Are there some in play that you can see that are out there? And what does this mean for Dade Phelan as the Speaker of the House? He's from Beaumont. The first time Beaumont has had somebody in that chair, probably in 100 years at least.
Maybe ever.
And so, like, he's in a really powerful position for a region that often feels misrepresented or not heard from enough. And so tell me about, like, what races you see out there that we should be watching, for a potential, if this state does get more competitive.
Well, and if there is a Democratic wave, as I mentioned, if there's a blue wave, there's a red wall in Texas. The structural advantage that Republicans have in Texas includes the way the districts are drawn, the way campaign finance is done. I mean, you have groups in this state that, if they think it's necessary, Texans for Lawsuit Reform is the biggest one, they can drop $10 million in the last week of the race if they think that they need to do that, which they did in 2020, by the way, trying to hold on to the majority in the Texas House. So that was prior to the redistricting cycle in 2021. As you look around the state now for the legislature, the partisan makeup is basically set, but you do have some key races. Here in Bexar County, there are two that I would keep an eye on. One is the seat held right now by John Lujan, South Side. He's facing Christian Carranzo, who's running an energetic campaign, and she's outraised him so far. You want to talk about a competitive seat, Jeremy? That's a seat represented by a Republican now that went for Biden 51-48.
Wow.
All right. So that's my top one at the moment right here in San Antonio. There's another one, the seat that's currently held by Steve Allison. Other seats are up in Dallas. There's one that's in the Valley that's probably competitive, but I thought it was interesting. The Governor Abbott the other day through Nueces County, where Corpus Christi is, he threw that into the mix. That tells me that Abbott is going to be spending some of his own money in this general, even though he's not on the ballot. So to your point about things being competitive, the Abbott campaign knows that. He's going to do it under the cover of saying, hey, I'm trying to get more votes for my school voucher initiative. But he's also just trying to shore up Republicans in the legislature, because he knows that they do face some losses in the fall if the energy continues like this in the big urban areas for the Democrats.
Yeah, it's interesting. The one thing that's very different from Texas than a lot of other states, and if you have people from other places wondering, where is the Texas Republican Party? Where is the Texas Democratic Party? Where do they fit in this stuff? And quite honestly, they are very underfunded compared to most states in the United States. They just can't help candidates much. So it becomes imperative for people like Governor Greg Abbott, who becomes essentially the surrogate Republican Party of Texas, to get involved in these races and help legislators, because there is no other cavalry coming. It's like they don't have anywhere else to go. You'll see Ted Cruz, as this race gets tight, he's going to make a national pitch to kind of get some of his big, deep funded donors up in Chicago and places like that, loading him up again and helping him like they did it in 2018. But those state house candidates, they need help. If they're going to get help, it's going to have to come from Governor Greg Abbott. He's going to have to be engaged in this if he's going to keep the majority that the Republicans have right now in the House.
And they're going to keep the majority. And but I do think that he needs all the votes he can get for certain initiatives, which we can get into. But you asked about Dade Phelan as well, and whether he's going to continue to be the speaker. It's the number one question I get all the time. And as we talked about on the Texas Take podcast, I try to keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening with Texas politics, especially the politics inside the Capitol itself. And Jeremy, like I told you on our show, I put my finger where the pulse ought to be in that race, and there is no race for speaker. There are a couple of announced candidates, but they're not getting any traction right now. I have to handicap it for Phelan at this point, but there's always a but, and this is not predictive, but you may end up having a race for speaker in December once we know what the partisan makeup of the House is going to be. If other candidates, potential candidates, see that they might have an opportunity, that's when you would see them announce. And for folks who are wondering about that, I would say this, that it's just way too early to know. When Joe Strauss from here in San Antonio, when he became speaker, he was the last idea anybody had for Speaker of the House. That's the short version of that. Same thing when Dennis Bonnen came in as the speaker after Strauss. Bonnen swore that he would never be a candidate for speaker. Suddenly he was in the running, and suddenly he had it. And when Dade Phelan became the speaker, he wasn't the first to announce, second, third. He was the 9th to announce that year. So we got a lot of baseball left to play.
Yeah, there's a lot of internal politics within the legislature that is hard to kind of see unless you're within that circle. And that's quite honestly, if Scott Braddock here, if you're not following the Quorum report, you're not getting that insight information. They do a bang up job of trying to get you inside and trying to figure out who's like really running the House, who's really running the Senate. It's like you'll get that out of his stuff. So certainly go check them out, become a subscriber there. And I wanted to talk about one of the reasons that we may not have all these seats flipping over like we did. Back in 2018, like 12 seats flip over in the House, a couple of seats go over in the Senate. Congressional races were close up and down the line. But again, going back to this blue spine, the reason that that is we're not seeing those flips happen again is because Republicans were paying attention. At least the smart Republicans were paying attention and acknowledging what was happening there. I count Governor Greg Abbott and his team as one of them who understood that, wait a minute, this is a warning shot. We better kind of get on our game. And so part of that getting on the game was not only just increasing their ability to register voters, which they have done. They have started to catch up with some of the Democratic gains that they've made, at least blunt some of that. But secondarily, that the redistricting. The redistricting was a vital component to trying to make sure some of these seats would not be in danger. We saw that in Harris County, particularly. Folks down there remember when Troy Nails, the former Fort Bend County Sheriff, who won his first race for Congress, he ends up winning by a narrow victory total because there's so many Democrats who live in Fort Bend County right now. It's been changing. So what was the solution? Was it to register more voters? No, it was to take out those Democrats and put them into Al Green's district, the Democrat from Houston, put more Democrats in his district and move the Troy Nails district further. And that happened in a lot of places throughout Texas, particularly on that blue spine and in Harris County, where they realized those were our problem spots. And we better start kind of doing something to protect ourselves other than just begging people to come vote. You got to play the game that's before you and not the one you want it to be.
That's right. And, in more than 2 decades of doing this, I'll tell you that nothing will make the audience's eyes glaze over faster than talking about redistricting. But Joyce nodding along. But let me tell you this. What's interesting to me is that because of and this is way down in the weeds, but Jeremy mentioned that's where we live at quorumreport.com. In the Texas Constitution, there's a rule that the districts for the Texas House, and this is only for the Texas House, it's not for Congress, not for the state Senate, for the House, for the state House, they have to keep the counties as whole as possible, which means that Texas House districts are the most representative of communities of interest, which interestingly also gives Democrats the best chance to flip things because that's where you have the most competition in some of those places. So that's why I would say we could see as many as, the Democrats net a gain of 3 seats in the Texas House almost without trying. I could see them, though, getting as many as 9 extra seats this year, depending on what kind of turnout there is in some of these places, including the places that you mentioned, like in Fort Bend County, Williamson County, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, watching this go forward, I think, there's going to be a lot to kind of pay attention to. Those redistricting, I love to kind of point to, Joy, you'll recognize this one from in Harris County. If you want to like check out this, the Sheila Jackson Lee congressional district and the shape of that, what they had to do to contort and twist and spin that thing around to make sure they would pack as many Democrats into that district so they wouldn't affect other districts. It's like now you have like, so many other congressional races. People will remember back in 2018 and 2020 how competitive those congressional cycles were. In fact, we had a record number of candidates running for Congress, not just in Texas, but in Harris County alone. We had so many candidates who were like, hey, I'm going to run for this seat because everything looked competitive. And so you had, Dan Crenshaw fighting for his life, in, the congressional seats. Troy Nails barely kind of squeaking out a victory initially. You had John Culberson losing his seat to Lizzie Fletcher. It's like, so you saw all that competitive. We just don't have that same level. But again, stay tuned, because I think the thing that happens when that top of the ticket changes as dramatically as we've just had happen, which has never happened in Texas history. Like we've never had a presidential candidate change this close to an election without, somebody losing their life, right? This is a case where we have totally changed the dynamics of this race, I think, at the very top. And I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know if the Kamala Harris energy that started off and this thing will sustain itself to November. And I think that it's a really important point. I wanted to make sure everybody remembers, like, we are 38 days from the start of voting. It's like the first military and overseas ballots are going to be in the hands of people on September 21st. And really important for people out there, voter registration. Like, October 7th is a deadline to register.
All right.
There have been a lot of changes to Texas, voter registration rules and laws. And there's, just this week, we had the Texas Secretary of State, Jane Nelson, almost bragging about how many people they've been able to remove from the rolls that they consider not legal voters. What that means, I don't have a full understanding of yet, but this is really important. If you are think you're a registered voter, go on the Texas Division of Elections website. They have a place where you can check to see if you're still registered or if you've been put into the suspended category or if your registration has been challenged. I think that's really important. Again, we're no longer a state, like for 10 years, we had 12 million registered voters in Texas. From 2000 to 2010 and 2012, we had 12 million registered voters. No more, no less. We never grew as a state. But what's happened since 2012 is we've added 4 million registered voters. Wait, no, check that. 6 million registered voters is what we're up to, that we've added just since 2012. So in a decade, we added 6 million people to our voter registration rolls. Again, these are new voters. These are people who never voted for George Bush in their life. This is their new politics. That's like us annexing all of the voters in Louisiana, Oklahoma, and New Mexico in that time period. It's changed the state, it's changed the energy, and it's made, making sure your voter registration is set up. Checked out that website. I'll have it on my Twitter account too. People can kind of check there to kind of like, use the link there to kind of get to it. But it is like, there's no going back. If you don't have this sorted up by October 7th, you're going to find yourself in a really world of hurt if you're going to go register to vote in November and find out that you were on the suspended list and now you have to fill an extra piece of paperwork to kind of get yourself there.
It's Trump. It's Trump. I mean, Joy, Joy, you might agree. It's Trump. I mean, you like numbers, Jeremy. Think about the fact that in the 2014 general election, there were about 4 million people who voted. That's an off-year election, right? That's not during a presidential. By the 2018 election, we had presidential turnout in Texas. It was doubled. 8 million people came out to vote in that election that Cruz almost lost to Beto. I always kind of laugh about this too, that for young people who are involved in politics now, here in Texas, they have the experience of having the best election that they've ever seen was one that they still lost to Ted Cruz. But there's kind of an imagination gap. I think for guys and gals about our age, I don't know if we can really imagine that a Democrat might be able to win in Texas because we just haven't covered that. We haven't seen it, right? For folks like my publisher who's 72, he can because he saw it before. He could see when the state was competitive in a way that would have statewide officials who were from both parties, right? We can't even almost imagine that now. And then young people, they haven't been through enough of these cycles where they're told the Democrats have a shot and then they lose every time. They haven't gone through enough of those yet to have that kind of a disappointed attitude, right? And so they can imagine it as well. Another key reason that, just for democracy, competitive elections are good. And I'm not going to sit here and say one party needs to win or the other, but I will say we had better Republicans when it was competitive. Now we have these ideologues who are doing these things that are not about investing in Texas' future. It's certainly not about anything that 25 years from now people are going to say, "Oh wow, I'm so glad they did that." Yep. What I mean, no, nothing like that. And so it's not aspirational at all. And in some ways, I think of it as the Republican Party in Texas now, as opposed to those guys like George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush who were in party building mode. What we have now on the Republican side around here is more like trust fund babies. They were just inherited this majority. And what are they really doing with it?
Well, and to your point, in the 1980s, if you grew up in Texas, you saw that seesaw of what Texas could be, in the future here, where you had, Bill Clement become, the first Republican to win the state as governor, and then he lost to Bill White. And it's like, and we had a seesaw of Democrat, Republican throughout the 1980s. And you if you grew up in the 80s like I did, you started, hey, Texas is going to be this way all the time, right? And not so. Well, one of the things that we would definitely want to do is keep those questions coming in our chat box here, in our Q&A, excuse me. And we're going to start going through some of those Q&A questions that y'all have. We'll address some of them. We talked a little bit about the voter registration totals. Well, our first question from Jenny Johnson is about the voter registration suspensions. That is a big deal. One of the things that gets you, one of the things that I think people should know, you get on that suspension list particularly if you've moved. If you moved within your county or to another county, and the division of, or the secretary, or not the secretary of state, your local election officials, who can be different depending on where you are, if they send you a piece of mail and it comes back to them, that can get you on a suspension list, as well as not having voted for a while. And so there's a lot of things that go into that.
And Jeremy, I think there are more than 2 million suspensions that are voting. So people really need to check their voting status.
Yeah, and that's a big thing. That's where you start getting into those on election day. If you go to the booth and you're not on their list, right? That's when they start handing you a paper ballot to fill out that may or may not be counted, and it just won't feel the same. You'll still get the sticker that says "I voted," but there's a good chance your vote won't get counted until 14 days after the election. So I would suggest, again, I make this a point every group I ever speak to. You got to make sure that something weird didn't happen to your registration. Whether intentional or unintentional, things happen, particularly if you've moved in the last year or two, or if you've moved since the last presidential election, you could be a suspended voter and not know it. So double check on that. Again, I'll have that on my X account for people, that link. So if you need to go there, it's Jeremy S. Wallace on X, and I'll have that link on there, after we finish the program. Secondly, okay, let's take another question. We had a question about North Texas and the voting populations and the changes up there. Boy, I think you want to talk about a place that really has seen that change. Collin County and Denton County. I think what has happened there. Look, suburban counties throughout Texas we talked about are changing, but it feels like what's happened in Collin County and Denton County has been life-altering in Dallas-Fort Worth. Right? That's become a battleground.
Yeah, Collin County, the folks who live there and live in those neighborhoods would say the neighborhoods are just nothing like they were before. They don't live next to the same people. It has exploded. That was all farmland, 20 years ago, and now it's all been developed. And people are moving in all the time, and they bring different politics with them. There are some folks who are some people. Some of the people who move from California. One of the things they say, this is where Democrats have to have their, have me rain on the parade. One of the things people moving from a blue state will say is, I'm moving to Texas because it's Republican. That does happen. But then there are others who come in who are moving in for whatever reason. They're moving in because most of it is because of the economy. They're moving in because there's a job here. The housing is affordable, compared to other places. great public school systems in places like Collin and Denton County, by the way.
Yeah.
That's something they brag about. With the realtors all brag about that when they're selling a house, right? And so they come in and they might have a history that is either mixed, voting for Democrats and Republicans, or they may be more Democratic. What has been interesting on the Republican side, as far as their sophistication in registering voters, is that there was a lot of talk among the chattering class in Austin about whether with all these people moving in, 1,200 people moving in a day, and that is the same number that was happening during even the height of pandemic restrictions, about 1,000 people moving to Texas every day, which is really remarkable. There was a lot of talk about whether Republicans could actually get it done as far as identifying people who had just moved here and figuring out the way they voted where they came from.
Yep.
Right. Because the Democrats, they sort of sweep with a wide net when they're doing their voter registration. And they always, I know they're doing this for fundraising reasons, but it ends up being an interesting tactical error, I think, to always announce exactly how many people you're going to register. So Democrats are going to register 200,000 people, so Republicans know to go register 300,000 people and find those people. And they do a decent job of asking people just questions to figure out where they might be. They'll walk up to you, outside the grocery store and say, "Hey, are you for gun rights? Are you for are you for abortion restrictions or whatever, pro-life, all this other stuff?" And then once they've got the answers, then they'll hand you the voter registration thing, right? Or not, depending on what the answers were. They have gotten very good at identifying those people who were Republicans when they lived somewhere else and moved to Texas, where we don't register by party. So it's a little harder to figure out where people are at, but with some detective work, they can figure it out.
Yeah, and one of the big points about Collin County is, guess what? They gave us Colin Allred. It's like, if you go back to his, the reason he's running for the U.S. Senate today is because he won that House seat, U.S. House seat up there against a Republican incumbent who had been there for a long time. But Collin County had changed so much that it changed the dynamics of that district. And so even when they did get to redistricting time, the solution was, well, let's just make Colin Allred's district safer.
Same
and
for
make
Lizzie
it
Fletcher
harder
in Houston.
Yeah, it's like, and so instead of keeping the fight up in a county that was shifting so much, they decided to move on from it. And I think what you've seen, particularly, like, I think during the Beto O'Rourke versus Ted Cruz U.S. Senate race, that's when I first started to see that, like, look, we knew Williamson and Hayes County, further down along the spine, were going to be a little bit more competitive. You could feel the energy, the registrations were happening. But I think what shocked people was how much Collin County, which has been a red beacon for much of the last 20 years, right? As it was growing, that's where a lot of the Tea Party groups in Texas were kind of basing themselves out of Collin County. And it's like, and then to have that place start turning at least a light shade of red, kind of, I think, threw off some of the math. So I think that's a big kind of piece to it. And I did kind of want to circle back to, the Colin Allred race. I have a question here about how Colin Allred is doing. And I kind of want to circle back to, like, one point on that U.S. Senate race that I didn't hit earlier. And I think I had the graphic up here earlier, which is, look, the thing that makes this race so different, or maybe more dangerous for Ted Cruz, in 2018, in that race where he only won Texas by 2.6% of the vote, or whatever it was really close, right?
Yeah.
A close race. But the problem was his numbers with independents, right? So independent voters, particularly, like, they're up for grabs, theoretically. And so with them right now, with those independent voters, Ted Cruz, he hit 51% disapprove of the job he's doing, according to the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas. They've been tracking number. That's at 51%. That is higher than when he was running against Beto O'Rourke.
Oh, right.
His numbers with independent voters somehow has gotten a lot worse and creates a battleground in these suburban counties that are shifting, with Trump at the top of the ticket again. Like, he now has, like, a situation where he has a lot more wind at his face as he's campaigning to try to convince voters that he's now a bipartisan guy, right? That's the thing that he's been trying to, as Colin Allred says, I'm the bipartisan guy. Guess what? Ted Cruz is like, no, I'm bipartisan. I work with people all the time. Although, if you've been reading my stories, like, the independent groups that do rate bipartisanship in Congress give him pretty low grade.
Right.
Of 250 people they've tracked over the last 6 years, he was number 245. He is right there next to Bernie Sanders in terms of bipartisanship. There's just not a lot there.
And I think if you scroll down, there's a lot more questions there probably. But on the question of those independent voters, it's interesting that the entire time I've been covering Texas politics, Jeremy, if you look at the self-identification of voters, it's always, at least on paper, been up for grabs at the statewide level because Texans prioritize their independence. So when you ask people, are they a Democrat or a Republican or an independent? So a lot of them just say that. Democrats, Democratic consultants 15 years ago would often make the joke about independent voters. They would say, well, they mean they're Republicans, right? That we can't get those people. But that's not true anymore, right? It's always been a third Republican, a third Democrat, and about a third independent by self-identification. But now those independents are truly up for they're not. It would just always be that they would break for the Republicans, but not anymore. Increasingly, those who say they're independent end up actually being independent, and they're open to voting for either party. And those parties need to really make arguments to them that resonate with those people if they want to get them to vote that way.
Yeah, a confession. I used to live in other states. You know, I had to live in Florida for a stretch, so I kind of watched kind of how the independents, you know, how voters participated there, and in New York and a lot of other places. But like, what's different about Texas for both Democrats and Republicans is that there's an independent streak in both parties that distrusts anything that's big. Generally, it's like it's unlike this in any other state, right? It's like, you know, you distrust big companies, big corporations that are telling you how to run your life. It's why I tell people this is why Ron Paul's revolution started in Texas.
I grew up in a congressional district.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason is because there's a libertarian streak in the Texas Republican Party that's always been there. Because again, there's this distrust of not just you know big government, but big business, big politics. You know, that's why you have this structure in Texas, even where we tried to create a system that the governor wasn't the most powerful person in the state. We tried to create a system where the Republican Party of Texas can't dictate politics to everybody else in the Republican Party. And so I think that's kind of what makes our independent, voice in Texas so much more wild than a lot of other independents. And one of our questions is about third party candidates and, can they break through? Can they actually, become any sort of a factor? Look, the system's set up for them not to.
No.
Like there's no reason for an incumbent in the Texas legislature to say, hey, you know what? I want more competition. Let's do something to help out. Like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will be on the ballot. And I'm not sure anybody knows exactly what the impact's going to be. I thought it was going to hurt Joe Biden and then now Kamala Harris. But then I'm in the NRA meeting in Dallas with Donald Trump, and he spent a good solid 10 minutes of his speech talking about Robert Kennedy and don't go vote for him. I'm afraid he's going to take votes away from him. And so I don't know if any of us know what that impact's going to be. Does Robert F. Kennedy Jr. take 3% of the vote? Does he become like Jill Stein and throw off the entire map? And that's huge in Texas, right? Again, if we're talking about a race that could be within 5 percentage points, anything that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. pulls off that top makes a closer race, and one that, like, look, if Texas comes out and we're less than 5 percentage points, you're going to see an all-out shootout in 2028. For Texas, there's going to be real panic on the Republican side going, we better be campaigning for 4 straight years.
Yeah, every Republican consultant that I talk to in this state says, regardless of who wins the presidential race this year, but this is even more pronounced if Trump were to win, that the 2026 cycle will be very competitive in this state. And that's recognized by Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and all the rest.
There's a question in here that I've been looking at, and I would like maybe you all can take a stab at it. It says, since LULAC endorsed Kamala Harris, will that impact the Hispanic population in Texas to vote more Democratic? What do you think?
I've had some great conversations with people in the Hispanic community, particularly about what does Kamala Harris represent, right? Like her diversity is clear. We already know that's out there. But really what she speaks to, and I think this is really important for our communities around Fort Bend County, near Harris County, and the diversity there. Like what she represents to a lot of people is a second generation, third generation American, whose family, may have been born somewhere else and are now American citizens. So she has an ability, at least on paper, to be able to talk about the experiences of being a second, third generation family in Texas politics and what that's like. It's like, look, people like, if you're Hispanic, that fight, it's like, what that conversation's like. It can get really uncomfortable where people, even though you've been here for 9 generations, assume you just got here yesterday. It's like, and you're like, well, why would that happen? I remember Eva Longoria, like her family has owned a ranch in Nueces County for something like, I want to say 100 years. And like she is more Texan than I'm more Texan, right?
Right.
And skin color shouldn't dictate that. And so I think there's the one thing I'm not sure if Kamala Harris is geared for it yet. The jury's still out on it. I'll be interested to see how she responds to it. And if she gets these endorsements from LULAC and other Hispanic leaders, what's that going to mean for us? So
yeah, and look, I think the experience of these various immigrant populations coming into America generally and Texas specifically, they get a mixed reaction when they come in, right? And they face discrimination in certain areas, but in other places they're welcomed with open arms. It was the former now late mayor of Houston, Bob Lanier. He would always say, in Houston, nobody cares who your daddy is. Everybody gets a shot, no matter where they came from, no matter who they are. And I think that's true. And those are in Texas generally, people have the shot, right? And so I think Republicans do themselves a huge disservice, and this was recognized by George W. Bush, by the people who used to run the Republican Party of Texas when they were in that party building mode. They understood that these folks are politically up for grabs. And for Latinos, for Hispanic Americans, those folks are among, studies show this, and you just see it in our lived experiences. They are the quickest to try to really join a community as a real member of the community when they get there. So there's a reason that there are a lot of Hispanic folks in Texas who end up as Republicans. They want to assimilate. They want to be like the folks who are here, right? And in California, the opposite, that most Latinos would go the other way. But all polling forever that I've been looking at it for decades shows that those folks are not monolithic, and they love it when someone who looks like me is explaining it, but not monolithic. They don't all think the same way, and when Republicans take such, and this has been especially true with Trump, when they take such an anti-immigrant position, and believe me, that's the way it's seen in those communities. I know there's some folks who are going to watch this and say, well, they're just against illegal immigration. What is it about illegal you don't understand? But when they take positions like Trump did, where he says, oh, they're not sending their best, well, guess what? Those folks may send a different message at the ballot box.
Well, okay, folks, I want to say thank you so much for joining us for this. This was kind of a test run for us to do this live in this type of setting for all of our Hearst publications. We really appreciate everybody joining us. Joy Suing, I can't thank you enough for joining with us and participating in your first Texas Take experience.
I know, right? This has been great. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot, so thank you so much.
No, it's great to have you on board, and even if you're not in Houston, you really want to check out Joy's columns. It's like they are very insightful. She's not always about politics; she goes far beyond that, obviously. But really worth your time if you go to the Houston Chronicle, the Express News, or any of our Hearst publications. Be sure to check her out. For sure, check out the Quorum Report if you want to know. I'll tell you this, whoever the next Speaker of the House is going to be, they're going to be first to report it. They're going to know what the politics of it was. They're going to be on top of it. So, certainly follow the Quorum Report. And of course, if you like anything I've said on this, or even if you don't like anything I've said in this, sign up for the Texas Take newsletter. Whether you like it or not, you can just you can hate read it if you need to, or if you want more insights and data, particularly. I really like to use the Texas Take newsletter differently than some of the other things where I can get into the numbers. You've seen it a lot on the reporting I've done on oil, like where our oil jobs are actually dropping, even as our oil rigs are producing more oil than ever. It's creating a dynamic in politics. You'll get stuff like that in the Texas Take newsletter. And of course, you have to, listen to the Texas Take podcast, the #1 political podcast in the great state.
For 8 years running.
Yeah, 8 years running. I've been on it for 6 years, certainly trying to help improve things as much as I can.
But Jeremy, I can always tell if people really listen to the show, that means they come argue with me about something.
Absolutely.
They don't just say, I love the show. They have an opinion they want to tell me, and it's always welcome.
Well, and one final pitch, like everything we're doing here, I wanted to make sure that folks outside of San Antonio and Houston realize we're here for you too. It's like, this is not just, for those communities. Like, we are all about the Beaumont Enterprise, Laredo, Midland, Plainview, like all of y'all are part of this kind of coalition. And we're writing about all Texas politics and talking about we're talking about Texarkana, we're talking about Amarillo, we're talking about Midland. You're all part of this equation. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Sorry I couldn't get get all the questions. I'll answer some of these in my Texas Take newsletter probably this afternoon, but be sure to sign up for that. Again, just Google it, Texas Take Podcast and Texas Take newsletter. You'll find how to sign up for all of it there. So again, thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate the time, and happy election cycle. And remember, October 7th, check that voter registration.
Right.